Hello, I'm Montse Alvarado. EWTN News In Depth is next.
When you get a different style of approaching God, a more poetic kind, it looks at God differently. It's more of a mystery.
Christian, Catholic, Maronite. A unique way of looking at God, all bound into the Catholic community of churches. An Eastern Rite church with ancient ties to Lebanon. We look through a Maronite lens at the current sectarian strife threatening to pull Lebanon into civil war. Why a leader in the Maronite Catholic Church in America says Lebanon is more than a country, it's a mission, with a special role in uniting religions. We go on the record with Bishop Gregory Mansour.
Sarah is being accused of and asked to bear the responsibility of all the sins of the Spanish Empire.
Saint Junipero Serra becomes a focal point for criticism of colonialism and brutality against Native Americans. We take a deep dive into his legacy and why his contributions to the New World are being misunderstood. And vocations in one of the toughest neighborhoods in America, ministering to the overwhelming needs of families in East Harlem, New York. We walk with the Sisters of Our Lady, Queen of Angels. EWTN News In Depth starts now. Hundreds of activists gathered in Martyrs Square in Beirut at the beginning of this week to commemorate the second anniversary of the start of the popular protest known as the October 17th Revolution. 2 years later, the revolution has all but fizzled out, with just a few hundred coming out for the protests as opposed to tens of thousands in 2019. The 2019 uprising was supposed to usher in more equality as protesters demanded the end of the political class that has ruled the country for decades. Welcome to EWTN News In Depth. This most recent protest occurred just days after deadly gunfire broke out at another protest. It lasted for hours and sent people running for cover. That violence, the worst in a decade, happened during demonstrations over the investigation of the Beirut port explosion that killed more than 200 people in the summer of 2020. Hezbollah claims the Lebanese forces Christian group were responsible for the deadly shootings. Their leader denies those claims. Now, Lebanon's top Christian cleric, Maronite Patriarch Bahara Boutros Al-Rai, is denouncing any form of violence and calling for the judiciary process to remain free from political interference. Turmoil and religious tensions exist within the backdrop of a country whose economy is in financial collapse and its government in chaos. We will discuss the implications of the multifaceted conflict with a panel of experts. But first, an understanding of Lebanon's largest Christian denomination, Maronite Catholics. They make up about 26% of the total population of Lebanon and are in full communion with the Holy See. Maronite Catholics also have a significant presence in the United States, as we learned from reporter Mark Irons.
And the gates of Sheol are broken.
United in morning prayer, these men are receiving education and formation to become Catholic priests.
Keep us free from sin.
Inside their seminary chapel, the candles, stained glass, and altar may look fairly common for a worship space, but these men are future priests of a church that even Catholics may not have heard of. It's called Maronite.
I was a total stranger to it.
Years ago, before studying for the priesthood, seminarian Alejandro Landon started to see the beautiful diversity in Catholicism.
That there were many ways that the church expresses its faith and its belief.
Catholics around the world are all united and can simply be called members of the Catholic Church. But within this global community are actually 24 churches, including the Roman Catholic Church and the Maronite Catholic Church. Each church has its own unique traditions, but all are in communion with one another and all are united by core beliefs. Though each church has its own internal leadership, the supreme head and spiritual leader over all of these churches on earth is the Pope. The Roman Catholic Church is most commonly found around the world, but the 23 others, referred to as Eastern Catholic churches, have spread out as well, including the Maronite Catholic Church.
Protect us in the shadow of your cross.
The church has deep roots in Lebanon, where the majority of Christians are Maronite. They are among the Christian minority here in the U.S., but still have a presence.
We have 95 Maronite churches.
One is here in the nation's capital, Our Lady of Lebanon Maronite Catholic Church. It's right next door to the only Maronite seminary in the country, where Monsignor Peter Azar is rector.
I feel I'm using my experience as a parish priest with our seminarians to prepare them about the parish life.
A parish life in the Maronite Church. Having its own liturgy, theology, and spirituality, more poetic than philosophical, as seminarian Alejandro Landon would learn. He grew up Roman Catholic and loved his church, but during his faith journey after college, he stopped at a Maronite church in Texas.
The prayers were very different, the chanting, almost the entire liturgy. It was kind of a shock for me, but a very pleasant one.
Listen and give glory and thanks to the word of the living God.
I think I remember my exact words when I left the liturgy was, I'm not exactly sure what that was, but I like it.
So much so that he is now a couple years away from being ordained a Maronite priest. And as such, will have the chance to call down the Holy Spirit in Aramaic.
It's the language of Christ himself. That will make us feel that Christ himself is working through the priest.
Monsignor Azar has been a priest for more than 40 years. He grew up in Lebanon and saw the country fractured by war. He's now concerned about family members back home caught up in the current economic crisis, but he's hopeful Maronites in Lebanon will remain resilient.
That hardship is driving us to a deeper faith in Jesus Christ.
The Maronite Church, just one among the global Catholic Church family, all united in faith. All Catholics can receive the Eucharist within these different churches and fulfill their Mass obligation by attending the different liturgies, and as a result, experience Christ in a new way.
You're sort of more in awe of him, and it's just a different way of approaching him.
Mark Irons, EWTN News In Depth.
For historical context about Lebanon and more about Maronite Catholics, we turn to the head of the American Maronite Church in the eastern United States. We travel to Brooklyn, New York to speak to the eparch, or bishop, of Our Lady of Lebanon Maronite Cathedral. In the U.S., the Maronite Church is divided into two dioceses, one in the west and one along the east coast, which has 45 parishes from Maine to Florida. This beautiful place of worship is the Maronites' mother church in the eastern United States. That's where we spoke, on the record, to Bishop Gregory Mansour, who has led the diocese since 2004. Tell us about the Maronite tradition. I don't know if there are Catholics around the world who don't realize that we have other traditions that are part of this global Catholic Church.
Yes, so when we talk about Christianity, there are Protestant Christians, there are Orthodox Christians, and there are Catholics. And the Catholic Christians, of course, but the Catholics have an amazing unity built in because we have Peter, the Holy Father. So the major church is the Latin Church, which everybody knows about, and they call that the Roman Catholic Church. But the Maronite Catholics, the Ethiopian Catholics, the Coptic Catholics, the Armenian Catholics, I don't want to forget anyone, but there are 23 different Catholic churches in communion with the Holy Father. And we call it the Catholic Communion of Churches. So we have already this amazing unity among ourselves, and that we're praying and working for unity with the Orthodox and one day unity with the Protestants.
Is there any difference in the spirituality and the belief, or is it something else?
So when we talk about a Catholic, these 23 Eastern Catholic and the one Western Catholic churches, the same essence of faith, but a very different expression.
Let's talk about Saint Charbel, this wonderful name in the Maronite tradition.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about this monk who is so loved.
He's a little bit like Padre Pio and a little bit like Teresa Lisieux. They never left their place, but they're all over the world. A great devotion. In fact, Cardinal Dolan was a large donor, wanted to put a shrine to Saint Charbel at St. Patrick's, and he called me, "Greg, what do you think?" So I said, "You know, Your Eminence, your place will never be the same." That's right. And certainly the people come from all over. Everybody has a great devotion to Saint Charbel. We don't know how it happened, but Charbel was a monk and a hermit. He had a deep devotion to the Eucharist. In fact, he died. He had a stroke by offering. He had a stroke, and then several days later he died.
In the middle of a consecration, he had a stroke, right?
Yeah, and a deep devotion to the Eucharist, deep devotion to Our Lady, and a faithfulness to his monastic life. So when the Patriarch came to dedicate at St. Patrick's Cathedral he looked around and he said, for a man who never left Lebanon, here he is on Madison Avenue in the middle of Manhattan, as a sign to call all of us in the modern city back to a deeper contemplative union with Christ.
And a deeper understanding of the Eucharist, which is so timely. With the Eucharistic revival and Eucharistic coherence being something we're talking about all the time.
Exactly.
So a saint for us
He
here
is.
in the U.S. as well. The political and economic reality in Lebanon. I know that you go there, you do a lot of church work there. Tell us, what is it that the church is doing or can do or should be doing in Lebanon?
Think of everything that the government should be doing and not doing, and the church is doing. Hundreds, if not thousands, of Catholic institutions serving the poor. Catholic schools, 321 Catholic schools, a couple dozen hospitals, nursing care facilities, drug rehabilitation centers, charitable works, St. Vincent de Paul, Caritas Lebanon. They're there with the most vulnerable and the people on the peripheries of society. And the church is there with no backup by the government. And so I tell people all the time, if you love Christ, if you love the church, if you love Lebanon, invest in these Catholic institutions. Don't let them go bankrupt.
So going deeper into the political reality of Lebanon, give us some background on the founding of this country, why it's so meaningful for Catholic, Christian, Muslim relations.
Thank you for that question. This is one of my favorite themes, if you don't mind. So after the Ottomans decimated that whole area, especially with Christian populations, in 1919, the Maronite Patriarch, with a few of his Muslim and Christian counterparts, went to Versailles, France, and urged the Allied leaders to carve out of Greater Syria a portion to call it Greater Lebanon. And interestingly enough, those boundaries included Shiites in the south, Sunnis in the north, Druze in the middle, all the Christian communities. And Montse, this to me is powerful, and it's lost on so many people today. Lebanon is one of the last Christian-Muslim convivialities. There are Christian feast days, Muslim feast days. Only Lebanon has a Christian-Muslim feast day, the Feast of the Annunciation, March 25th. So Lebanon's specificity, its mission, its nature, John Paul II got it right when he called Lebanon is more than a country, it's a mission. So for me, it bothers me when people think Lebanon's special calling is just like any other nation. It's not. And if we lose this Christian-Muslim conviviality, we are forever lost. And I'd hate to see that happen.
It's definitely something that we know the Pope has focused on. Pope Francis and the Holy Father has done a lot to reach out to the Muslim community.
You know, he did for instance, he did a visit to the Grand Imam, Al-Azhar in Egypt, and he developed a good rapport with the Sunni Muslims through him. And when he went to Iraq, he visited Al-Sistani, and with that visit, he made an open door to Shiite Muslims. So he did for Islam what John Paul II did for Judaism, which he re-established the bonds of friendship, and hopefully this will be a brighter future for people who have a sincere religiosity, whether as Catholics or Muslims.
So there's something troubling about that, because when you look at the Muslim majority countries, there's a lot of great persecution of Christians within them.
Oh my God.
It's
very sad to say that, but it is true. In Muslim majority countries, Jewish citizens, Christian citizens are often seen as second-class citizens. And in most of those countries, they have fled. Just Lebanon is left. And in Lebanon, there's something very beautiful. A Muslim person can be judged by his own courts with Sharia law. And so can a Christian person by their own law when it comes to family matters. But it comes when it's civil and criminal, it's by the state. And in this sense, a person is respected in
The
his
full
own
person.
faith. The full person,
Right.
religious freedom.
Right, right, right.
And if you don't have a robust religious freedom, as we're losing here in the United States, unfortunately, if you don't have a robust religious freedom in other places, people lose. Their identity is lost.
So in thinking about this tension between friendship with the Muslim community and also the reality of the importance of learning how to live with each other, but not being persecuted, what is your personal message? What is your personal desire in what Catholics should be doing when they think about Christian-Muslim relations?
I think, so my experience with Catholic Relief Services and with Caritas Internationalis is so beautiful. In all the different communities where they served, 120 different countries, you had Christians and Muslims working charitably for others, whether the population was Muslim or Christian or Hindu or Buddhist. I saw that, and so I feel strongly that Lebanon still has that. And we have to find a way to work. There's lots of work to be done in charitable work. In Afghanistan, for instance, there were 300 Catholic Relief Services people serving in Afghanistan.
Yes.
To me, that's beautiful. It was a 99% Muslim country. In many places in Africa, there are Catholic charities and Catholic universities and Catholic schools and Catholic outreach. It's just very beautiful. Muslims tell me, when they know that I was serving on Catholic Relief Services Board, they said, thank you, because you've done so much for our people back home.
Because of our understanding about the human person and human dignity,
we
allow them to be who they are, and we hope
Yes.
that they'll allow us to be who we are.
Yes.
Bishop Mansour, it's such a treat to be chatting with you, and
Thank you.
we'll be following the issue of Lebanon closely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go to EWTN News In Depth social media to hear more from him about the perils of government control in religion and the importance of the American witness to religious freedom. Next, after the break, our expert panel joins us to discuss the current economic and political strife in Lebanon, the danger it presents for this country at the crossroads of religious violence, and the wider implications this Christian-Muslim tension has for the region.
Hail Mary, full of grace, Lord is with thee.
Coming up, as we celebrate the feast day of St. Pope John Paul II, we show you the journey of hundreds of people walking in his footsteps to renew their spirits and deepen their faith.
The needs of the human being are the same anywhere you go. And the need is for love, the need is for belonging, the need is for God.
And later, contemplative nuns in action. Prayer leading hands-on work in the gang-filled neighborhoods of Harlem. Sisters trying to reach young people before it's too late. The worst violence that Beirut has seen in 10 years. Welcome back to EWTN News In Depth. I'm Montse Alvarado. Lebanon's political crisis intensified on October 14th after deadly shootings in the capital city. At least 6 people were killed when the gunfire broke out at a protest being held by Iran-backed Hezbollah and their Shia allies, the Amal movement. The gun battles lasted for hours, continuing after the army arrived. Lebanon's interior minister says a sniper fired the initial shots. Hezbollah blames the Lebanese Forces Party for the attack. The Christian-based political party denies the accusations. All of this links back to that massive explosion at Beirut's port in August of 2020. The deadly blast killed more than 200 people and injured thousands more. Demonstrators have been calling for a removal of a judge currently leading an investigation into that explosion. The leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, says Judge Tarek Bitar is biased. Nasrallah also warned on Monday that his militant group has 100,000 trained fighters. The recent clashes could set Lebanon into deeper political and economic turmoil. In the last few years, more than 70% of the population has fallen into poverty. To help us better understand the impact of Lebanon's circumstances, we're joined by Tanya Khoury, Vice President of In Defense of Christians, and Andrew Doran, a former State Department official serving on the Executive Secretariat of the U.S. National Commission for UNESCO. Thank you so much for joining us, Andrew and Tanya. Tanya, the investigation over the explosion in Beirut last year is featuring quite prominently as a way to control the narrative. Is it likely the judge investigating, Tarek Bitar, will be removed?
Well, I hope not, but Hezbollah is trying very hard to have him removed. They are accusing Judge Battar of being biased, which is completely untrue, because as the lead investigator, if you look at the list of the people that he has interviewed and wants to interview, they come from a variety of groups, actually including the former prime minister, who is Sunni. So it's completely untrue what they are accusing him of, but it is incomprehensible that the largest non-nuclear blast in history.
Tanya, how have the events of October 14th affected this situation?
So October 14th was very significant in what happened. And Hezbollah and Amal entered into the Christian area of Ain al-Rumayni fully armed with RPGs, machine guns, and handguns, protesting and threatening the people of that area, trying to get Judge Battar removed from the investigation. And knowing Lebanon and the history of Lebanon and the people of Lebanon, nothing is by accident. It was very purposeful that they picked that area, Ain al-Rumayni, to do this protest, again, fully armed. Because back in the 100-Day War, where Syria bombed and pounded on Christians for 100 days, the Christians stood strong and prevented them from overtaking Ashrafiyeh, which is in the same neighborhood. So Hezbollah enters into Ain al-Rumayni, a Christian area, fully armed and threatening the people there, pretty much to send a message that, hey, we're Hezbollah and we can do whatever we want.
Fully aware of what that threat would mean.
Absolutely. Instigating the people, the Christians who live there. And the Christians who live there said, no, Hezbollah, you're not. We're tired of your bullying. We're tired of your fear-mongering. We're tired of you undermining our Constitution. And the Christians responded to their threats. That's what happened on October 14th.
Andrew, news of Lebanon's struggles are nothing new. In a recent article, you painted the picture of a people who want peace but are oppressed by elites who seek war to gain power, something like what Tanya is describing. Can you explain this further?
Yes. So since the end of the civil war in 1990 and the subsequent 15-year occupation by the Syrians, the government of Lebanon was essentially the weaknesses, the venal weaknesses of many of the leaders, including Christian leaders, were exploited by Iran, Hezbollah, Syria, and other forms of foreign influence. And the leadership of Lebanon was essentially made prone to corruption. At the same time, Iran's proxy, Hezbollah, established a shadow state, shadow military, even a shadow economy. And every time the legitimate institutions of Lebanon are weakened, those shadow institutions of Hezbollah grow stronger. The problem, and I think perhaps a miscalculation by Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah, is that now Hezbollah is known to be very prominent in its influence over the country. And while they don't yet control it all geographically, they do have significant sway over Lebanon's institutions. And so the failure of Lebanon has been, in the eyes of the Lebanese people, now closely associated with that of Hezbollah. So I think, in addition to the points that Tanya made, the fact is that October 14th seems to signify that Hezbollah may feel vulnerable. And so that show of strength was fairly significant, and that the Christian neighborhood did not simply, it's not the first time that Hezbollah has marched into a Christian area with many armed troops, but this is the first time that they were fired upon and withdrew.
And this is another example of villagers on the ground defending themselves are the Druze villagers, right? There was a situation as well with them?
That's right. Earlier in the summer, Hezbollah, what appeared to be Hezbollah militiamen carrying rockets that they were prepared to fire into Israel, were attacked by Druze villagers. Now, the Druze villagers were perfectly aware that they were, in effect, being used as human shields, which is a common tactic of Hezbollah. They will even use women and children as human shields. But the entire village rose up against these Hezbollah militiamen and drove them out. And so these are the sorts of things that expose, in a sense, the fragility of Hezbollah. But Hezbollah benefits from the weakness of and corruption within Lebanon's political institutions, and that really is what led to the crisis that began in the fall of 2019 with the economic collapse, which has been followed by political instability, the absence of a government, and of course the catastrophic August 4th, 2020 port blast, which was really the result of systemic dysfunction and a lack of accountability within the Lebanese government.
Accountability that they're searching for now. Tanya, this is personal for you. What can you tell us about the Maronites in Lebanon and the day-to-day effects of these conflicts on their lives?
It's heartbreaking. You know, my husband was born and raised in Lebanon. We still have a lot of family there. And who's being hurt most are the just regular Lebanese people. There's no gas. The electricity goes out frequently. Prices have skyrocketed. They're now paying $5 for a loaf of bread. There's no jobs. You know, people go to college and they expect to get a job. There's no jobs. So it's devastating to them. And Lebanese people are very resilient. I mean, if you look at their history, again, they have survived a lot. The Christians in Lebanon have survived a lot. People wrote them off many a times, and they refuse to be written off. So they're very resilient, proud, godly people. But they are being pushed to the limit for sure right now.
Andrew, the Muslim-Christian reality in Lebanon is somewhat of a unique reality based on the founding of the country. Can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like today?
Yes, absolutely. There's really nothing else like that in the Middle East. The Christians are responsible there for creating a number of educational institutions, including universities, which were done in cooperation with Western contributions. But the university system, the healthcare system, the business acumen of the Lebanese people, all of this is really unique in the Middle East, as is the pluralism that exists between Christians, Sunni, and Shia and Druze in Lebanon. And it's a very precarious and delicate balance that has been restored in some sense after the end of the Civil War, but upset by things such as the influx of Syrian refugees, which would be the equivalent of the United States assuming something like 100 million refugees relative to our population. So the very precarious balance is now at risk if the Christian population dwindles. And as a number of people have noted, I think policymakers have noted that there is a risk of Lebanon being reabsorbed into Syria. There's a risk of a civil war. There's a risk of a Sunni-Shia conflict if the Christians were not there to serve as a kind of leavening presence. So Lebanon is very unique, and the catastrophic economic and political challenges that it faces are threatening now to do what could not be done in 15 years of civil war and 15 years of Syrian occupation, and that's to end the very unique Christian presence in the region.
And Tanya, where is this path forward? What does that look like?
So, coming from a Christian perspective, I would like your viewers to realize the Christians in Lebanon is so important, not only because they're our brothers and sisters, obviously, in Christ, but because all of the Christians in the surrounding area that flee their countries because of persecution, whether it be Iraq or Syria or Iran, they flee to Lebanon. Lebanon is the last refuge for Christianity in the Middle East because Christians in Lebanon still have freedom. You know, as Andrew alluded to, they're part of the government. The president must be Christian. It's written in their constitution. The president must be Christian. The prime minister must be Sunni. And what would be equivalent to the Speaker of the House must be Shiite. So it is very, very delicate balance. But it is imperative that Christians remain in Lebanon and Christianity remains in Lebanon. And I would just like your viewers to understand one thing about the Christians in Lebanon. There are different groups. But when it comes down to it, when it comes down to the fundamentals of Christians in Lebanon, they always unite. It's proven throughout history that it doesn't matter if you're Lebanese forces or Kitab or Harat, they always unite. So that is very important for us to support the Christians in Lebanon as Catholics, you know, Christianity only exists today, 2,000 years later, because of Catholicism. And if we let Christianity,
will appreciate that for sure.
But if we as Catholics allow Christianity to disappear in the Middle East, where it all began, I'm sorry, but woe to us if we allow that to happen.
That's right. Well, we will keep tracking this developing story for our viewers. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having us.
There's much more to come on EWTN News in Depth. Last week, we talked about Catholic Native Americans, sometimes misunderstood and hurt by the very church they called their spiritual home. This week, is America's first Hispanic saint taking the fall for harm done to Native Americans in California?
This man has been the object of slander, outright lies, and so it's on us to better inform ourselves about it so that we can speak about it articulately with charity and begin to celebrate this man again.
Junipero Serra, defender of the rights of Native Americans, honored and named a saint in 2015. Now, just a few years later, he becomes a lightning rod of our country's racial strife. That story when we return. The Catholic Church is increasingly becoming the target of vandals. Crosses, statues, stained glass, and edifices have been broken, marred by graffiti, and burned at parishes across the U.S. In New York City this summer, police arrested a woman for toppling 2 statues at Our Lady of Mercy Church in Queens and repeatedly slamming them to the ground until they broke. The Cathedral Basilica of the Immaculate Conception in Denver suffered vandalism last week. Red spray paint covered the front doors and edifice of the cathedral. A statue of St. John Paul II was also damaged. The USCCB says that 3 churches, including the cathedral, have been targeted and vandalized in just the last 2 months in the Archdiocese of Denver. And just days ago in Los Angeles, the facade of St. Peter's Italian Catholic Church was vandalized with red paint. Volunteers quickly jumped in to clean it up. Catholic images are also being targeted at the legislative level. The state of California has made several moves to remove images and the legacy of St. Junipero Serra. Dr. Matthew Bunson, executive editor of EWTN News and our Washington bureau chief, is here to explain.
Montse, St. Junipero Serra is one of the founding fathers of the church in Latin America and what became the state of California.
That's right.
But because of the controversy surrounding the historical treatment of Native Americans, legislators and activists in California have been working very actively to erase his image and legacy from churches, parks, and schools. Fortunately, church leaders and scholars are standing up to defend his true legacy.
When you look at Junipero Serra, I think it's very important to put it in context, the time that he lived.
The history and treatment of the indigenous peoples of California is complex, controversial, and often painful.
Serra was a part of the colonial efforts of Spain coming out here to the Americas. He was front and center in that.
St. Junipero Serra, a devout Franciscan, came to the Americas to proclaim the gospel and bring souls to Christ.
But it was 2 things. It was the churches, the missions, and you had the government aspect of it, which was the presidios.
Presidios, or military forts, housed Spanish soldiers. Scholars say Serra saw native populations, particularly women, being abused by the soldiers and others living at the presidios, which prompted him to move the mission away from the dangers. But he didn't stop there to protect native communities.
He goes to Mexico City with a lengthy memorandum of something like 8,000 words, insisting on the observance of what we would today call the human rights or the civil rights of the native population. So Serra was a great defender of the rights of these people whom he loved and wanted to see saved, eternally saved.
Pope Francis proclaimed Junipero Serra a saint in 2015 during his visit to the United States. He is the first Hispanic saint of the U.S. Just a few years later, however, as political and racial divides continued to grow in the U.S., California legislators passed a bill almost unanimously to replace a statue of St. Junipero in Sacramento, claiming enslavement of both adults and children, mutilation, genocide, and assault on women were all part of the mission period initiated and overseen by Father Serra. The Hispanic Council recently defended Serra, declaring, "This new attack on his figure lacks historical rigor. It's also an attack on the Hispanic legacy of the United States and California, which must be respected and cherished, as Junipero himself represented in his time of dedication and service to the native population. Archbishops Jose Gomez of Los Angeles and Salvatore Cordileone of San Francisco wrote a forceful op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. They said that while there is much to criticize from this period, no serious historian has ever made such outrageous claims about Serra or the mission system, the network of 21 communities that Franciscans established along the California coast to evangelize Native people. We understand the bitter history of Native exploitation, but history can be complicated and facts matter. St. Junipero Serra's mission work was not easy. He left a prestigious position as a scholar in Mallorca, traveled to the New World, and was a great architect of the missions in California during his lifetime.
And the acknowledgement that this man, quite apart from the supernatural realities that he brought to the natives in terms of opening the gates of heaven, brought extensive contributions at the natural level. Agricultural contributions, irrigation, crop rotation, animal husbandry, textiles, metallurgy, tanning, polyphony, my personal favorite, viticulture.
But this history seems to go unrecognized as racial, political, and cultural tensions in the U.S. seem only to be escalating. Attacks on his legacy continue. Statues of Serra have been taken down across California. Especially shocking was the assault on the statue in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco.
Serra is taking the blame for everything that happened bad in colonial times.
Assaults that scholars say are undeserved.
This absolutely heroic man who just gave his life to his last breath so that people could spend eternity with their Creator in heaven.
Yeah, Montse, it's pretty clear that the attacks on St. Junipero and the attacks on churches and parks are not going to end soon, anytime soon.
No, they're not going anywhere. And it's crazy to think that this great gift that Pope Francis wanted to give the American church is being completely turned upside down. What can we do to correct this narrative?
Well, let's go back to 2015 at the time of the canonization. There was a lot of outrage. There were a lot of complaints that Pope Francis, of all people, someone from Latin America, should be canonizing somebody like St. Junipero Serra. And yet, we're seeing today this escalation of that same type of thinking. What we can do is continue to get the message out. Help people understand what the true historical legacy, what is the context of his time, and also to understand that these attacks are both historically unfounded, but also academically unsound.
And then what can we do to really understand what is happening in our culture? This cultural moment is so weird, it's so bizarre that he would be blamed for things that he himself was fighting.
Well, it's not exclusive to St. Junipero Serra. We are seeing similar attacks on the church. We're seeing similar attacks on Christianity, in which that which is considered virtuous now in culture is considered unvirtuous when the church practices it. For example, the defense of women, that the church is anti-science. So we're seeing this sort of odd mirroring of fact and history. The way we can continue to combat that is to encourage our bishops to speak out, but also for Catholics to be speaking out, lay Catholics, scholars, academics, people in media, helping to get that message out about what is the true legacy of not just of Junipero Serra, but of the church in the United States and around the world.
Exactly, the legacy of the church. Well, we're going to do our part. Thank you so much, Matthew.
Good to be with you.
When we come back, an update on the missionary kidnappings in Haiti, news about COVID booster shots, and COVID claims the life of one of America's greatest soldiers and statesmen.
When we try and convince young people who feel that they are low risk from the virus itself why they need to be vaccinated, it's to protect our treasures, our people like General Powell, our grandparents.
A great American leader has died. We honor his memory, and some wonder whether his death might represent a wake-up call for the rest of us. The Week in Review is next.
At one time, polls showed he was the most trusted and popular man in America. The death of Colin Powell tops the Week in Review. In 40 years of public life, he served as the nation's top soldier and later top diplomat. A 4-star Army general, Powell became the first black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and then the first black Secretary of State. His death this week from COVID complications shocked the nation and his many admirers.
The world lost one of the greatest leaders that we have ever witnessed. Alma lost a great husband, and the family lost a tremendous father. And I lost a tremendous personal friend and mentor. He has been my mentor for a number of years. He always made time for me, and I could always go to him with tough issues. He always had great counsel. We will certainly miss him. I feel as if I have a hole in my heart.
Born in Harlem to Jamaican parents, Powell spent 35 years in the Army, serving 2 decorated combat tours in Vietnam. As chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he was the architect of the Persian Gulf War in 1991. Once out of uniform, he was courted by both political parties as a potential presidential contender. But his legacy is not without controversy. He later said his biggest regret was the speech he gave as Secretary of State in 2003, in which he presented the U.S. case for an attack on Iraq, asserting the country had weapons of mass destruction. We now know those claims were based on faulty intelligence and led to a war which dragged on for 8 years, taking thousands of lives. His death this week of COVID at the age of 84 came despite being fully vaccinated. But doctors say he was unusually susceptible to COVID. He was elderly and he was immunocompromised. He had both Parkinson's disease and multiple myeloma, a form of blood cancer.
It's also important to understand that the treatment for multiple myeloma, which patients often take every day, itself can suppress the immune system. So General Powell represented our most vulnerable population in this country. He was over the age of 80. He had cancer, and the treatment for his cancer made him vulnerable.
Powell's longtime assistant said he was slated to get his booster shot last week, but was too ill to receive it. Dr. Reiner and other leading medical professionals said Powell's death highlights the need for others to get vaccinated to lower the chances of passing the infection to those whose bodies can't fight it. Late Thursday, the CDC recommended booster shots for some recipients of the Moderna and Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccines, making tens of millions of Americans eligible to increase their protection against the coronavirus. It also said consumers could mix and match and choose a booster from any of the 3 approved vaccines, including the already authorized Pfizer shot. The CDC says those eligible for a booster include anyone 18 or over who took the single J&J shot, who has gone at least 2 months since getting vaccinated, and recipients of the Moderna or Pfizer shot who are 65 or older, or an adult with underlying health conditions or job exposure who have gone 6 months since their second dose. COVID vaccines for children ages 5 to 11 could be just weeks away. This week, the Biden administration said it has secured enough vaccine supply to vaccinate the 28 million children in that age group. The FDA and CDC's decision on the Pfizer vaccine for children is expected soon. If approved, the vaccines will be offered through pediatrician offices, schools, and other community-based sites. As with adults, the vaccines should be a 2-dose series given 3 weeks apart. Medical news from Britain, where Buckingham Palace announced Queen Elizabeth II was hospitalized overnight on Wednesday to undergo what it called preliminary investigations. Earlier this week, the Queen, who is 95 years old, canceled a 2-day visit to Northern Ireland on advice of her doctors, who advised her to rest for a few days. The palace said she has returned to Windsor Castle and remains in good spirits. No further details on her condition or the nature of the medical tests were released. An emotional plea for prayer as a gang in Haiti demands $17 million ransom for the Christian missionaries they kidnapped, or else they will be killed. That's $1 million for each hostage, 16 Americans and 1 Canadian. Gang violence has increased in recent months in Haiti. The missionaries were taken last Saturday after visiting an orphanage in a Port-au-Prince suburb. Among the men and women taken are also 5 children, ranging from an 8-month-old baby, a 3-year-old, 6-year-old, and a 13 and 15-year-old. The families of the hostages released a statement.
We thank him that he is God and ask him to hear our prayers and bring our families home. We also pray that the light of God's love might shine out against the darkness of sin, that the gang members might be freed from their bondage to sin and experience freedom in Jesus Christ.
The FBI is now part of a coordinated effort to rescue the missionaries.
And just in Friday, in the twin cases related to the Texas heartbeat law at the Supreme Court, the justices have now agreed to hear expedited argument on November 1st in the case brought by abortion clinics Whole Women's Health and the Department of Justice, fighting the Texas heartbeat law, SB 8, that bans abortion when a fetal heartbeat is detected around 6 weeks and has been in effect since September 1st. A heartbreaking update on the story of Alta Fixler, a toddler we told you about over the summer. She has now passed away after the United Kingdom's High Court ordered her removed from life support. Fixler was born with severe brain damage at birth and could not eat, breathe, or drink without medical intervention. UK law allows the courts to decide the best interests of children in extreme medical cases. Alta's parents are Orthodox Hasidic Jews whose faith dictates that saving a life is a duty, and the preservation of human life overrides any other religious rule. They sued for the right to keep Alta alive, but ultimately lost the case. Most troubling for many following this case is the following quote from the court ordering, stating that doctors and nurses are permitted in accordance with their clinical discretion to administer medication that may have the secondary effect of reducing the child's respiratory effort. At the heart of the legal battle that ended in Alta's court-ordered hastened death is the issue of parental rights, the protection of life, and the role of religion in treatment and care of a patient. Alta's funeral was held on Monday. Our prayers go out to Alta and her family, especially her parents, Abraham and Haya Fixler. And a 10-year-old boy captured the hearts of those watching the Pope's weekly audience on Wednesday. As priests were making introductory prayers and addresses, the boy unexpectedly walked on stage, greeted Pope Francis, and asked for his white skullcap. The Pope had him sit beside him for a while, and the audience broke out with applause when the boy left the stage, having been given a skullcap of his own. After the incident, the pontiff praised the spontaneity and freedom of children. Ahead on EWTN News In Depth, another Pope is our focus as we celebrate the feast day of St. Pope John Paul II.
There is a gang problem, right here in our neighborhood, and it is not uncommon to hear the sound of gunshots.
You hear the sound of gunshots sometimes?
Oh, yeah, not infrequently, not infrequently at all.
And next, taking God to the streets, helping to turn the tide of violence in one of America's most challenging communities. Women religious on the front lines when we come back. God is smiling down at Our Lady Queen of Angels Convent in East Harlem, New York. That's where religious from the Franciscan Sisters of the Renewal spend hours in contemplative prayer before springing into action to serve the community around them. In a neighborhood of poverty, violence, and gangs, their mission is a blessing. Reporter Colin Flynn has their story.
There is a gang problem, right here in our neighborhood, and it is not uncommon to hear the sound of gunshots.
Victim after victim after victim.
If someone's in a gang, they're looking to belong. Everyone's looking for love. Everyone's looking for what they're ultimately created for. Everyone's looking for God. Everyone's looking for God.
Christian, 111. Are you gonna help your mom?
In Our Lady Queen of Angels Convent in East Harlem, a family is paying a visit to pick up food supplies for the week.
I always draw art every day.
You like the art the best?
Yeah.
Do you have a project you like the best?
This is a common type of visit the sisters get from families who are struggling in the neighborhood. Mother Claire is the superior. When you look around here in Harlem, what is the greatest need you see?
There's so many needs. There are so many needs. The needs of the human being are the same anywhere you go. And the need is for love, the need is for belonging, the need is for God. We have a lot of homelessness in this area, so we see a lot of homeless people. And then we have the situation of families. We have very, very many migrant families who have made their way, from Central America here to New York City, but struggling to survive. First of all, our work is prayer, because we're contemplatives in action. So we do take our prayer life very, very seriously, praying, of course, the Divine Office, the Holy Mass every day, Eucharistic adoration, and that is central to our life. But our work is hands-on work with the very poor.
Very, 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 very thank you for whatever you gave me.
They need to be seen and to be cared for, to be loved.
In another part of the convent, Sister Elizabeth Marie is in the clothing pantry.
Twice a week, the homeless and the poor are able to come to our convent and ask us for clothes. With the homeless being on the streets, if it's a big rainstorm, they'll just come drenched and just ask for a brand new set of clothes.
Before we started recording, Sister had just been attending to a man who came to the door.
The doorbell rang today, and I went out, and this man, first thing I noticed was his shoes clunking around. He had no shoelaces in his shoes, and I remembered that when you go to a psychiatric ward or place, or when you go into jail, sometimes they'll take your shoelaces to protect you from harming yourself.
In the kitchen, Sister Catherine from Wisconsin and Sister Jacinta from the UK are making sandwiches.
We are making sandwiches for our door ministry, and which we do every Monday and Wednesday. People can come, get a sandwich, cup of coffee.
Sister Catherine comes from a sporting background as a speed skater.
So when I was 17 years old, I competed in the Winter Olympic Games for the U.S. speed skating team. A big change, but I wouldn't want to be doing anything else.
And previously, Sister Jacinta worked in healthcare.
I was actually an occupational therapist, so wasn't expecting to be a nun. But then I actually saw Pope John Paul II in Rome in the year 2000, and he just changed everything.
The sisters are hoping to reach the youth in the neighborhood before they get involved in gangs.
Young children going into the gang lifestyle.
Like how young would they be?
I think, 12 and 14, 12, 13 and 14, I think young kids of that age.
Do the people here have a sense of God or faith?
People do have a sense of God. They see us and they know that we represent God somehow. And we just open the doors of the church and the sisters go out and just make a simple invitation. Would you like to come in and light a candle? Would you like to come in and spend a moment of prayer? We were stunned by the outcome of that night. Almost no one refused us, whether they were, young teenage boys in a gang, or whether they were, older people, and everyone in between.
So even the gang members, you're stopping them and saying...
Absolutely. We just didn't want to say a prayer, and this sense of, I need God. And God is good. He's good. He's only good. He's always good, and his plan is good. But and we know that, we know that in our minds, but to believe it in our hearts and then live from that place is an entirely different thing.
Well, they're caring, they're generous, they help other people, helped me when my mom was in trouble. They're angels like God.
Your hopes and dreams for the future, for yourself and for the sisters here in Harlem?
I hope and pray that we will remain faithful to God. That's all that matters is remaining in the will of God, no matter what it looks like exteriorly. Again, the maternal face of the church that's safe and available, but God knows, so we pray and we live and he'll work out the rest.
In Harlem, New York City, Colm Flynn, EWTN News In Depth.
There's an extended version of this interview, more from Mother Claire about the sisters' work. Plus, she shares with Colm the story of her own vocational journey. You can watch it on the EWTN YouTube page. This weekend marks the feast of St. Pope John Paul II. Celebrations and remembrances are happening around the globe. And from our backyard in the Washington, D.C. area, we bring you our images of the week. About 400 people participated in a day-long journey called Walking with John Paul II, a pilgrimage of faith, following in his spiritual footsteps as they renewed and deepened their faith.
The 12-mile walk started at a suburban Maryland church, wound through a large park in the city, stopped at a second church and the St. John Paul II Seminary before ending at the JP2 National Shrine in Washington. St. John Paul II himself loved the outdoors, and along the way, the pilgrims enjoyed nature. They stopped several times to recite the rosary, sing songs of praise, and have group prayer. The pilgrimage ended with a mass at the shrine and a chance for a new generation to admire a saint known for his global impact. We're grateful for our viewers and thank you for joining us for this edition of EWTN News in Depth. I'm Montse Alvarado. I hope you'll join us again next week as we continue the conversation about matters important to our Catholic life. See you then.